"You're going to kill everyone," the senior captain screamed. Then she did something pilots are never allowed to do. She pushed the plane's engines until they started destroying themselves. 418 people on board, 52 of them kids. 8 minutes until the engines die completely. Miles of empty forest below. No airport they could reach by following the rules. So she broke every single rule and saved everyone. Before we dive into this incredible story, comment below which country you're watching from. Captain Ann Richter walked through Frankfurt Airport security at 8:47 a.m. She was about to fly from Germany to Los Angeles on a huge Airbus, a 381 of the biggest passenger planes in the world. This giant plane has 2 floors and can carry over 500 people. Ann was 38 years old and had been flying for 14 years. She was a senior captain, which means she was really experienced. But there was something scary in her work file, 2 warnings. She had broken rules twice before to save planes in emergencies. The aviation authorities told her, "Break one more rule and you'll never fly again." Today, Ann wasn't the main pilot. She was the relief pilot, the backup captain who sleeps during most of the 11-hour flight and only flies for a few hours to give the other pilots rest. It should have been the easiest job ever. The main captain was Klaus Weber, age 56. Other pilots called him the regulator because in 28 years of flying, he had never broken a single rule, not once. He believed rules were written in blood, that every aviation rule existed because someone died, and breaking rules dishonored their sacrifice. Ann respected rules too, but she believed differently. She thought that sometimes, in extreme situations, following rules could be more dangerous than breaking them. Weber started the safety briefing. "We have 391 passengers today, plus 27 crew members. That's 418 people total. Weather looks good over the Atlantic Ocean. We'll fly around some storms over Canada. We have plenty of fuel. Everything is planned perfectly." He looked at the crew seriously. "Rules exist because people died so we could learn. We honor them by never breaking protocols. Fly by the book and the book will bring you home." If you're enjoying this story so far, hit that like button. The massive A380 was incredible. It was 240 feet long with wings stretching 262 feet wide. Longer than a football field. It stood 7 stories tall. 4 huge engines hung under the wings, each producing 70,000 pounds of thrust. Together, they could push this 575-ton flying machine to 43,000 feet, high and across oceans at 560 miles per hour. At 10:31 a.m., the plane pushed back from the gate. The engines started one by one, a rising whine as each turbofan engine came to life. All systems showed green. Everything looked perfect. At 10:47 a.m., the control tower cleared them for takeoff. Lufthansa 455, runway 25C, cleared for takeoff. Weber smoothly pushed the thrust levers forward. The massive plane rolled down the runway, faster and faster. At 182 miles per hour, Weber pulled back on the control stick and 575 tons of metal lifted gracefully into the sky. Frankfurt disappeared beneath them as they climbed through clouds into brilliant blue sky. At 41,000 feet, that's almost 8 miles high, they leveled off, cruising at 560 miles per hour toward America. Ann went to the crew rest area behind the cockpit. It was a tiny room with bunks where pilots could sleep during long flights. She set her internal alarm for 5 hours. Experienced pilots can train themselves to wake up exactly when needed. She closed her eyes and fell asleep to the gentle hum of the engines. She dreamed of falling, which pilots often do. In her dream, she was flying an old plane and all the control cables were breaking one by one until she was falling toward the ocean with controls that didn't work. Stay with us. What happens next will shock you. 7 hours into the flight, Ann woke up suddenly. Something was wrong. The plane was shaking, but not normal shaking from bumpy air. This was different. This was the kind of shaking that meant the engines were in trouble. She jumped out of the bunk and ran up the stairs to the cockpit in seconds. The scene was terrifying. Weber sat stiff in the captain's seat, staring at screens filled with red and yellow warning lights. The first officer, Maria Schneider, was on the radio calling for help. And the sound, all 4 engines were making sick, grinding noises. They were failing. Status? Anne said sharply. Weber's face was calm, but his words were scary. All 4 engines are failing. Started 8 minutes ago. We're over Canadian wilderness, 400 miles north of Montreal. The nearest airport is Montreal, but it's 87 minutes away at our current speed. And the engines are getting worse. Anne looked at the engine displays and her stomach dropped. The numbers told a terrifying story. Engine temperatures were climbing. Toward the danger zone, the engines were vibrating badly. Fuel flow was unstable. All 4 engines were dying at the same time. This shouldn't be possible. 4 independent engines don't just fail together randomly. Something was wrong with the fuel, or ice was being sucked into all the engines, or something in the air was hurting them. Whatever the cause, the math was brutal. They were losing their engines. Without engines, they couldn't stay in the air. We think it's contaminated fuel, Weber continued, his hands moving through emergency checklists. We've declared an emergency. I'm following all the approved procedures to stabilize the engines. Anne watched him work and saw the problem immediately. Weber was doing everything perfectly according to the manual. Every checklist item, every procedure, exactly as the plane's manufacturer and the airline had written, and it wasn't working. Comment below if you'd follow the rules or break them in this situation. The engines kept getting worse despite Weber's perfect execution. Anne pulled up the navigation screen and did quick math in her head. They were over the vast Canadian wilderness. Hundreds of thousands of square miles of forest and lakes with nobody living there. Montreal was 87 minutes away, but that was if the engines kept working. Anne looked at the engine data. At the current rate of failure, all engines would die completely in 8 to 12 minutes. Here's the scary math. The A380 can glide really well for such a huge plane. It can glide 20 miles forward for every mile it drops. From 41,000 feet up, that means it could glide about 140 miles, but 140 miles wasn't enough to reach Montreal. It wasn't enough to reach a NY airport with a runway long enough for an A380. The math was simple and brutal. If they followed standard procedures and waited for the engines to die, they would become a 575-ton glider that couldn't reach any runway. They'd be forced to crash land in the forest. With 418 people on board, including 52 kids, almost nobody would survive. Klaus, Anne said, using his first name to get his attention. Your procedures won't get us to Montreal. We need to consider other options. Weber didn't look away from his screens. We will continue following approved checklists until the engines quit. Then we'll follow emergency procedures for landing without engines. The A380 has established procedures for this scenario. Anne felt frustrated. The glide procedures won't reach any airport from here. You're planning a controlled crash into the forest. We will follow emergency procedures as required by regulations, Weber said firmly. That is what the rules say. We don't abandon procedures because the situation is difficult. Anne stared at him. Weber genuinely believed the rules would work. He'd spent 28 years proving that following the book always brought him home safely. Anne knew something Weber didn't know, something secret that wasn't in any official manual. Keep watching, this is where it gets intense. 5 years before, joining the airline, Anne had worked as a test pilot for Airbus in France. She helped develop emergency procedures and tested the A380 at the extreme edges of what it could do. During testing, they had explored an extreme emergency procedure for situations where standard rules weren't enough. They called it Terminal Thrust Protocol. Here's how it worked. If you absolutely needed more power and had no other choice, you could force the engines beyond their safety limits. You'd push them past the red lines on all the gauges, past maximum temperature, past maximum RPM, past everything the engines were designed to handle. This would destroy the engines, but before they exploded, they'd produce much more power than normal. That extra power would push the plane farther before the engines died completely. The procedure worked. Test pilots proved it worked. Running. Engines at forbidden power settings gave 18% more thrust for 12 to 15 minutes before the engines destroyed themselves. That translated to about 85 to 90 extra miles of range. But aviation authorities refused to approve it for real flights because it required deliberately breaking engine safety limits. It required intentionally destroying your own engines. Every aviation rule is built on operating equipment within safe limits. Allowing procedures that break those limits would undermine everything. So terminal thrust protocol existed only in test. Pilot knowledge, shared quietly among the small group of pilots who'd tested it, but never written in any official manual, never approved, never legal. Anne had flown 3 test flights using terminal thrust protocol. She'd felt the engines scream as they exceeded safe speeds. She'd watched temperatures climb into ranges that melted engine parts. And she'd measured the results, 85 to 90 extra miles of range. Suddenly, the math changed in her head. Their current position plus normal glide range wouldn't reach Montreal. But their current position plus terminal thrust protocol, extra range plus normal glide range, could reach Bagotville Airport, a military base in Quebec, 320 miles away. Bagotville had problems. It wasn't approved for a 380 operations. It didn't have the right equipment. Landing there would violate multiple laws about where civilian planes could land. But Bagotville had one critical advantage. It was within range if she was willing to destroy the engines to get there. What would you do? Keep watching. Klaus, Anne said quietly. We need terminal thrust protocol. Weber's hands froze. His eyes found hers. That procedure is not approved. It's not legal. It violates engine safety limits and requires intentionally damaging the engines. I know test pilots developed it. And I know it is absolutely against regulations to use it. It will extend our range enough to reach Bagotville, Anne said. Bagotville is not approved for a 380 operations, Weber shot back. Landing there violates aircraft laws. Even if your procedure gets us there, we'd be breaking laws. We'd be alive breaking laws instead of dead following them. Weber's face hardened. I have flown for 28 years without breaking a single rule. Not once. Through storms, through mechanical failures, through challenging situations, I have trusted the system. I will not start breaking regulations now, because I'm facing a difficult emergency. We will follow approved procedures. That is final. Anne felt time compressing. Every second mattered now. The engines kept vibrating, getting worse. 8 minutes until complete failure, maybe 10 if they were lucky. Then 140 miles of gliding into forest with 418 people. She thought of the passenger list. 391 passengers included 52 children, babies, little kids, teenagers traveling with parents who trusted the airline to keep them safe. 418 people who had no idea they were 8 minutes from disaster. Klaus, she said, making one last try. Your procedures will kill everyone. I'm not being dramatic. The math doesn't work. We can't glide to any runway from here. You're flying us into a forest crash. We will execute emergency procedures as Airbus designed them, Weber said flatly. Maria Schneider, the first officer, spoke hesitantly. Captain Weber, maybe we should consider alternatives. First Officer Schneider, Weber interrupted. You will follow my commands. This discussion is over. Anne looked at the dying engines. Looked at the map showing 400 miles of empty forest. Looked at Weber's rigid posture showing absolute certainty he was right. Then she made the decision that would either save 418 lives or end her career forever. Or both. You won't believe what happens next. Klaus, Anne said, her voice absolutely calm. I am relieving you of command under emergency authority. You are no longer the captain of this flight. I am taking control, and I'm going to use terminal thrust protocol to reach Bagotville Airport. You are relieved. The cockpit went silent except for the vibrating engines. Weber turned to stare at her, his face showing shock, then fury. You cannot relieve a captain without just cause. This is mutiny. This is illegal. I am reporting you for unauthorized assumption of command. For breaking every regulation about command authority. Anne was already moving to the captain's seat. Physically removing Weber, he resisted for a moment, then stepped aside. You don't fight in a cockpit when lives depend on everyone staying focused. Maria, Anne said sharply to Schneider, call air traffic control. Tell them we're declaring an emergency and using non-standard procedures. Tell them we need priority to Bagottville and we'll be violating multiple regulations getting there. Make sure they understand we know we're breaking rules." Schneider hesitated. Looking between Anne and Weber, she faced an impossible choice. Follow the captain who'd been relieved, or follow the relief pilot who'd committed mutiny. "First Officer Schneider," Weber said with cold fury, "I order you to ignore Captain Richter's illegal commands." Anne met Schneider's eyes. "Maria, 418 people. 8 minutes until engines fail. Your choice. Support my rule breaking or support his procedures. Choose fast because we're out of time." Schneider's face showed agony. Then her hands moved to the radio. "Gander Control, Lufthansa 455 declaring emergency. All 4 engines failing. We're using non-standard procedures outside approved limits. Requesting priority to Bagottville Airport. Be advised we know this violates regulations, and we're doing it anyway." The controller responded immediately, stress in his voice. "Lufthansa 455, understand emergency. Bagottville is not approved for a 380. Confirm you understand." "We understand. We're out of options and out of time. We're going to Bagottville using procedures that will break every rule necessary to get there alive. This is unbelievable. Stay tuned." Anne's hands moved through terminal thrust protocol, the procedure she'd memorized years ago during test flights. The procedure that existed only in experienced pilots' memories, because no manual would ever officially contain it. First, she isolated the fuel systems to prevent contamination from spreading. Second, she configured engines 1 and 4, the outer wing engines, for terminal thrust operation. This meant turning off the protective software that prevented exceeding safety limits. She was telling the computers to step aside and let her destroy the engines. Warning messages flooded the screens. Engine 1 limiter override active. Engine 4 limiter override active. Exceeding manufacturer specifications. Turbine overspeed imminent. What are you doing? Weber's voice came from behind, horror replacing anger. You're turning off the engine protection systems. Those exist to prevent catastrophic failure. I'm going to cause catastrophic failure, Anne said steadily. Controlled failure that gives us extra range before the engines destroy themselves. Third, she pushed the thrust levers for engines 1 and 4 past their normal maximum. The levers had stops at 100% power, but she pushed hard, feeling resistance, then feeling something give way as the levers moved into forbidden territory. 105%. 110%. 115%. The response was immediate and terrifying. Engines 1 and 4 screamed with a sound that wasn't normal. A rising shriek of turbine blades spinning faster than they were designed to spin, pushing air through systems stressed beyond their limits, generating thrust through pure mechanical violence. The vibration became earthquake-level shaking. The entire plane trembled as the engines tore themselves apart, producing forbidden power. Engine speeds climbed past 100% into the red danger zones. 103%. 107%. 112%. Exhaust temperatures that had been yellow caution now blazed red. Warning, 543 degrees Celsius. 168 degrees Celsius. Approaching temperatures that would melt engine parts, but thrust increased dramatically. Their descent rate decreased as extra power pushed them forward. Ground speed jumped from 492 knots to 531 knots. You're destroying the engines, Weber shouted. You're exceeding maximum speed by 12%. The engines will explode. They'll explode in a way I control, Anne said, watching the numbers with laser focus. We're buying range, Klaus. Every second at this power adds miles we need to reach Bagottville. Terminal thrust for 12 to 15 minutes will give us about 87 extra miles. That plus gliding range will barely get us to the runway. Can you imagine being on this plane? Comment your thoughts. Warning tones sounded continuously. Red lights flashing everywhere. Engine 1 overspeed. Engine 4 overspeed. Structural stress excessive. Turbine overheat. Maria's voice came tight with stress. Captain, Engine 1 showing metal particles and oil. We're getting internal damage. Expected, Anne said. Turbine blades at these speeds will shed material. We're not trying to save the engines. We're using them up completely to buy range. She reduced power on engines 2 and 3 to 95%, hoping to keep some power available for landing. The navigation screen updated with new calculations. Bagotville showed 287 miles ahead, now within possible range if she could keep terminal thrust running for 14 minutes before engines 1 and 4 destroyed themselves. Then glide the rest of the way. It was barely possible. Everything had to work nearly perfectly while she deliberately broke equipment. Weber's voice came from behind, now containing genuine anguish. You're exceeding aircraft limitations. You're operating outside approved procedures. Even if this works, you'll be prosecuted. You'll lose your license permanently. You'll face criminal charges. I'll face those charges on the ground where 418 people will be alive, Anne said. Better than the alternative where we all die following procedures that weren't designed for this. The terminal thrust operation was brutal. The cockpit shook continuously. The sound of screaming engines penetrated everywhere, a mechanical shriek of equipment dying through the windows. Anne could see distortion around the engine nacelles where exhaust was hotter than designed, where parts were stressed beyond their limits. 0.5 minutes into terminal thrust. Engine 1 at 114% speed. Temperature 189 degrees Celsius. Engine 4 at 113% speed. Temperature 176 degrees Celsius, both shedding metal particles. Vibration climbing, every indicator screaming that catastrophic failure was coming, but ground speed held at 534 knots. Distance to Bagotville decreasing, 251 miles, 244, 237. Gander Control reports Bagotville is ready for emergency landing, Maria said. They're asking about our approach capability with damaged engines. Tell them we'll fly non-standard approach, Anne said. Tell them we can't meet normal approach requirements. Tell them we're coming in fast, steep, and wrong by every regulation. Tell them to clear emergency vehicles and prepare for possible runway overrun. This is getting intense. Keep watching. 8 minutes into terminal thrust. Engine 1 vibration reaching critical levels. The entire left wing shaking visibly. Engine 4 exhaust temperature hitting 193 degrees Celsius. Well into the range where turbine blades lose strength. The engines were on borrowed time. Distance to Bagotville, 198 miles, 10 minutes. Engine 1 showing signs of imminent catastrophic failure. Oil pressure dropping. Vibration exceeding maximum sensor range. Exhaust temperature at 117 degrees Celsius. Distance to Bagotville, 173 miles. She needed just 4 more minutes. 4 more minutes of engines staying together while being abused beyond imagination. 12 minutes. Engine 4 began trailing visible smoke. Not normal exhaust, but dark smoke showing internal parts burning. The engine was eating itself from inside while still producing thrust. Distance to Bagotville, 151 miles. Engine 4 fire warning, Maria called. Getting flame indication. Acknowledged, Anne said. How bad? Internal fire, not yet breaking through containment, but building. We need 2 more minutes from that engine. 13 minutes. Engine 1 exhaust temperature hit 134 degrees Celsius and suddenly stabilized, which was actually bad news. Stabilization at extreme temperature meant parts had melted to the point where they weren't working anymore. Just hot metal spinning. Thrust from engine 1 began dropping. Distance to Bagotville, 137 miles. Shutting down engine 1, Anne announced. It's done. She pulled engine 1 controls to cut off. The dying shriek wound down, suddenly making the cockpit quieter despite 3 engines still running. 1 of 4 engines completely destroyed. Turbine melted. The entire engine reduced to expensive scrap hanging from the wing, but they'd extracted every possible mile from it. Terminal thrust protocol had worked exactly as designed. Destroy the engine while maximizing thrust before failure. 14 minutes. Engine 4 fire warning intensified. Engine for fire severe, Maria called. Recommend immediate shutdown. Anne checked the distance, 128 miles to Bagotville. She ran glide calculations in her head. From 41,000 feet with the A380's glide ratio, they could glide 140 miles. They were close, so close. "Anne," Maria said urgently, "Engine 4 fire is critical. If it breaks through, we risk wing fire. Decision point. Shut down the burning engine now and hope they were close enough. Or keep running it for 30 more seconds, but risk catastrophic fire. Shutting down Engine 4. We're close enough." Engine 4 shut down. Its fire warning clearing as fuel stopped feeding the flames. 2 of 4 engines completely destroyed. $47 million in damaged equipment. But they bought 87 additional miles that made the difference between possible and impossible. You have to see how this ends. Now she was flying a 575-ton A380 on 2 engines that were themselves failing. With 418 people on board, toward an airport not approved for her aircraft. Planning an approach that violated every rule ever written. "Maria, verify we have hydraulics, flight controls, and electrical systems. Klaus, I need your help despite everything. Check landing gear and flap systems." Weber, still furious at her mutiny, was professional enough to check systems when 418 lives depended on it. Landing gear available. Flaps operational, but we're outside normal speed ranges. "We'll deploy them early and accept the structural stress," Anne said. "Everything we do from here violates normal procedures." She began descending, pulling power back on engines 2 and 3 and pushing the nose down. The A380 began dropping through 39,000 feet, then 37,000, trading altitude for distance. Bagotville Tower contacted them. "Lufthansa 455, Bagotville Tower. We have you on radar 102 miles north. Be advised, our runway is 10,000 feet long. You are much bigger than aircraft we normally handle. What are your intentions?" Anne keyed the radio. "Bagotville, we're going to land on your runway using non-standard procedures. Request clear all emergency vehicles to the runway and prepare for possible overrun." "Understood. Runway 11 is available. Current 1's 130 at 8 knots. Rescue services standing by." They descended through 30,000 feet. Engines 2 and 3 kept running, but showing continued problems, vibrations increasing, temperatures climbing. Thrust slowly decreasing. She was racing time and physics. Trying to reach the runway before the last 2 engines quit. At 18,000 feet and 65 miles from Bagotville. She made another rule-breaking decision, deploying landing gear. "We're 150 knots above normal gear speed," Weber protested. "You'll exceed structural limits. We need drag to slow down. Gear deployment at high speed will damage parts, but it will slow us down." She selected landing gear down. The massive landing gear minus 22 wheels total. Deployed into the high-speed airflow, the plane shuddered with stress. Red warnings appeared. Gear deployment over speed. Structural limits exceeded. But the gear locked down and their speed began dropping rapidly. At 12,000 feet and 38 miles from runway. She deployed flaps, the wing surfaces that increase lift and drag. "Still above flap speed," Weber said mechanically. "You're exceeding limits. More drag. More shaking. More speed reduction. At 8,000 feet and 22 miles from runway. More flaps. Speed dropping through 270, 255, 240 knots. She could see Bagotville now, a military base with one long runway carved through forest. The runway looked impossibly short for an A380. At 5,000 feet and 12 miles from runway. Engine 2 fire warning lit up. "Engine 2 fire," Maria called. "Shutting down Engine 2, Anne said. Now they were down to 1 working engine out of 4. She was essentially flying a glider now. 1 dying engine providing barely enough thrust to slow their descent. At 2,000 feet and 5 miles from runway, the final engine quit. Engine 3 temperature spiked red. Thrust dropped to 0. This is it. The final moments. Suddenly they were truly a glider minus 575 tons of aircraft, with nitrogen monoxide thrust at all. Only gravity pulling them toward Earth. "We're committed," Anne said quietly. No power available. Flying final approach is pure glide. Anne flew the approach by pure judgment. No engine power to adjust their descent. No power for a second attempt if she misjudged. The A380 descended through 1,000 feet. 800, 600, you're too fast, Weber said. You're 30 knots over proper approach speed. I can't go slower without power, Anne said. We're landing fast. The runway threshold passed beneath them at 400 feet. 300, 200. She pulled back gently on the stick, raising the nose to slow down in the cushion of air just above the runway. The main landing gear touched down hard. Boom. Boom, as the 3 sets of wheels hit concrete with excessive speed. Spoilers deployed automatically, panels rising from the wings to kill lift. Anne deployed thrust reversers on all 4 engines, even the dead ones. To gain maximum drag, the A380 slowed with all systems screaming maximum effort. Spoilers up. Reversers out, maximum braking on all 22 wheels burning rubber against concrete. Through the windscreen, Anne watched runway disappear beneath them, faster than she'd like. Speed decaying but not fast enough. They rolled past the halfway point. 5,000 feet remaining. They rolled past 2,000 feet remaining. Speed still 80 knots when they should be stopped. They rolled past 1,000 feet remaining. Speed finally down to 40 knots, but still rolling. The runway ended. The A380 left the paved surface and rolled onto grass beyond. The nose gear cut through turf, leaving deep ruts. The massive weight caused it to settle into soil after 400 feet of grass cutting. 11 hours and 53 minutes since departure. Having traveled 4,287 miles across ocean and continent, Lufthansa Flight 455 came to rest with all 418 souls alive and uninjured. If you made it this far, smash that like button. Anne sat in the captain's seat, hands still on the controls, feeling her hands shake as adrenaline faded. Through the windscreen, emergency vehicles raced toward them, red lights flashing. Behind her, Weber stood silent. Anne keyed the PA system. Ladies and gentlemen, we've landed safely at Bagotville Airport in Quebec. Emergency services are approaching. Please remain seated with seatbelts fastened. Thank you for your patience during this emergency. She sat back, closing her eyes for a moment. She'd broken 17 separate aviation regulations. She'd committed mutiny. She'd destroyed 4 engines worth $47 million. She'd operated equipment beyond safe limitations. She'd violated manufacturer specifications. She'd flown an unauthorized approach to an unapproved airport. Every single charge would be factually correct. Every violation was documented by the aircraft's recorders, and 418 people were alive because of those violations. Weber's voice came from behind, quiet but certain. You will lose your license for what you've done today. I will file formal charges. Even if everyone survives, you broke fundamental rules. You've ended your career, Captain Richter. Anne opened her eyes and looked at him. I know. The emergency evacuation went smoothly. All 418 passengers and crew exited via inflated slides, gathering in the grass beside the runway while emergency personnel checked for injuries. There were none. The children, who'd slept through the emergency, woke confused about why they were sliding down ramps onto grass. Their parents held them close, crying now that the crisis had passed, grateful that someone had broken rules to save their families. What would you have done? Comment below. The investigation began within 2 hours. German Aviation Authority officials started immediately. The flight recorders were removed, containing perfect documentation of every rule Anne had broken. Dr. Ellen Morrison, the Canadian lead investigator, assembled the crew. Captain Weber, walk me through your decision-making. Weber's response was comprehensive. I followed established checklists for engine deterioration, executing each procedure according to specifications. I planned emergency landing following certified procedures. I followed regulations at all times. Morrison nodded. Captain Richter, your statement? Anne took a breath. I recognized Captain Weber's by-the-book approach wouldn't reach any airport. I relieved him of command without consent, assumed control, and executed terminal thrust protocol, an uncertified procedure from test pilot training that involved deliberately destroying engines 1 and 4 by running them beyond safety limits to extend range. I then flew non-standard approach in violation of speed restrictions and airport certification. I broke 17 regulations deliberately. Morrison looked up. "You're confessing to violations." "I'm stating facts," Anne said. "I broke rules deliberately because Captain Weber's rules would have resulted in forest crash with 418 fatalities. My rule breaking resulted in aircraft damage but 0 fatalities. Those are the facts." Weber stood abruptly. "She's admitting to mutiny, unauthorized procedures, and equipment damage. I want formal charges filed immediately." Morrison raised a hand. "Captain Weber, sit down. I'll determine charges. Right now I'm gathering facts." The German Aviation Authority representative joined via video. Dr. Hinrich Vogel. "Captain Richter, you have 2 previous warnings for rule violations." "Yes, sir. You were warned any additional violation would result in permanent license revocation." "Yes, sir. You admit today's violations?" "I do." Vogel nodded slowly. "Then revocation proceedings begin immediately. Surrender your license. You will not fly any aircraft pending investigation. You will face civil penalties for equipment damage and possible criminal charges." Anne felt grief twist in her chest. 14 years of airline career gone. But when she closed her eyes, she saw those 52 children sliding into their parents' arms, alive because she'd broken rules. "I understand," she said quietly. "Don't go anywhere, the story continues." The investigation expanded over weeks. Lufthansa suspended Anne immediately. The German Aviation Authority assigned a full investigation board. Airbus sent teams to examine the destroyed engines. Captain Weber filed 17 separate formal charges. Every charge was accurate, supported by flight recorder data. Impossible to dispute, he testified before the board. Aviation safety is built on rules pilots follow without exception. If we allow pilots to decide which regulations apply based on personal judgment, we destroy the framework that keeps flying safe. Captain Richter broke fundamental rules. She must face consequences, or we're saying rules don't matter when pilots think they know better. But the 418 survivors told different stories. Passengers organized petitions supporting. N-387 signatures from people aboard flight. 455. Parents of the 52 children wrote emotional letters describing gratitude. That someone valued their children's lives over regulatory compliance. Flight attendants testified Anne's actions saved everyone when standard procedures would have failed. Airbus engineers examined the destroyed engines and confirmed terminal thrust protocol functioned exactly as designed during development. Engines operated at 115% thrust had generated additional range before failure, extending capability by 87 miles as predicted. The engineers testified the procedure had always worked, but had been rejected for approval because it violated manufacturer limitations and required intentionally damaging equipment. Dr. Morrison's Canadian investigation concluded. Captain Weber's actions were procedurally correct but tactically inadequate. Following approved procedures would have resulted in emergency landing in wilderness with projected 100% fatality rate. Captain Richter's actions violated regulations but extended range sufficiently to reach Bagotville, resulting in aircraft damage but 0% fatality rate. From outcome perspective, Captain Richter's violations prevented mass casualty incident that Captain Weber's compliance would have caused. The media coverage was intense. News outlets characterized Anne as either hero pilot who saved 418 lives or reckless rule breaker who endangered passengers. Almost done, you have to hear the ending. The German Aviation Authority board hearing convened. 3 months later, Anne appeared before 5 officials who would determine her fate. Dr. Vogel read the formal charges: unauthorized assumption of command, 17 regulation violations, equipment damage, unauthorized procedure execution, violations of international aviation law. Anne's statement was brief. I broke 17 regulations. I damaged $47 million in engines. I violated international aviation law. Every charge is correct. I did these things because 418 people would be dead if I'd followed procedures, including 52 children. Captain Weber's by-the-book approach was procedurally perfect and would have been fatal. If following regulations means watching people die when I know how to save them, I will break regulations and accept consequences. I'm not asking for mercy. I'm stating why I made the choices I made. Weber testified against her. She's asking you to accept that pilots can override regulations whenever they personally believe rules are inadequate. That's not how aviation safety works. We follow procedures because they're developed by experts and proven effective. The line between heroism and negligence is defined by whether you followed certified procedures. Captain Richter violated that principle. We cannot reward rule breaking without undermining the entire regulatory system. The 418 survivors had no formal role, but their presence was felt. Letters flooded the board from passengers. Families of the 52 children organized outside the hearing holding signs. "Thank you, Captain, and she saved our children." One father, Thomas Mueller, spoke to reporters while holding his 6-year-old daughter. "My little girl slept through the whole emergency. She has no idea her life was in danger. Captain Richter broke rules so my daughter could wake up alive. I don't care about aviation regulations. I care that my daughter has a future because someone was willing to break rules to save her." The board deliberated for 4 days when they reconvened. Dr. Vogel's face remained unreadable. "The board has reviewed all testimony and technical analysis. We find that Captain Anneliese Richter did violate 17 separate regulations during flight, 455 emergency operations. These violations are not disputed. The question is whether those violations warrant license revocation under circumstances where violation prevented mass casualty incident." Anne stood to hear her fate, feeling strangely calm. She'd done what she'd done. If they took her license, she'd accept it. She'd still saved 418 people. Vogel continued. "We are confronted with a question about the purpose of aviation regulation. Are rules meant to be obeyed for their own sake, or are they tools designed to achieve safety? We conclude they are tools, imperfect tools developed by humans, tested under limited conditions, designed for scenarios that cannot possibly anticipate every situation." He paused. "Captain Richter broke 17 regulations. She also prevented 418 deaths. We cannot ignore either fact. Therefore, this board suspends Captain Richter's license for 18 months, requires additional training, and places permanent monitoring in her file." Anne felt dizzy. 18-month suspension, not permanent revocation. She'd keep her license. She'd fly again. Vogel wasn't finished. Furthermore, this board formally requests Airbus conduct comprehensive review of terminal thrust protocol for possible certification, as Airbus formally requests Airbus terminal thrust protocol. Emergency procedure of last resort. Captain Richter's use was a violation, but the procedure proved effective. If it works, perhaps it deserves official recognition. We cannot ask pilots to break rules in emergencies, but we can expand the rules to include procedures that might save lives. This ending will give you chills. Anne walked out into bright sunshine where the families waited. The father with his 6-year-old daughter approached, tears streaming. "Thank you. I don't understand aviation rules, but I understand my daughter is alive. Thank you." Anne knelt to the girl's level. "What's your name?" "Emma," the girl said shyly. "Emma, you were very brave on the airplane." The girl looked confused. "I just slept. Mama says you saved us." Anne glanced at the parents, then back to Emma. "I did my job. Sometimes doing your job means doing things differently than expected." 18 months without flying felt like a lifetime. Anne took consulting work with aviation safety organizations, spoke at conferences about emergency decision-making. The aviation industry remained divided about her actions, some praising her, others condemning her violation of regulatory structure. Airbus formally certified terminal thrust protocol after 2 years of additional testing. publishing it as an emergency procedure, authorized only when 4-engine failure occurs beyond gliding range of any airport. The procedure acknowledged engine destruction would result, but calculated destruction was preferable to uncontrolled failure when no alternatives existed. Anne's name appeared in technical acknowledgments as the test pilot who validated procedure effectiveness. Under actual emergency conditions. Captain Weber continued flying with perfect procedural record. He never publicly changed his position that Anne's rule breaking was wrong regardless of outcome. But privately, colleagues noted he'd become slightly less rigid, occasionally willing to discuss scenarios where procedures might prove inadequate. First Officer Maria Schneider eventually became captain herself, flying with both Weber's precision and Anne's willingness to question whether procedures covered every scenario. Anne returned to flying after her suspension. She spent 3 years with a cargo airline, rebuilding her reputation, demonstrating her rule-breaking had been necessity rather than recklessness. Eventually, Lufthansa offered her return to passenger operations. She accepted with the condition she'd never serve with Weber, not because of animosity, but because their philosophies were too different. She flew a 380s again, carrying hundreds of lives across oceans. She followed procedures carefully, adhered to regulations completely, and established a reputation as a reliable pilot who respected rules. But everyone who flew with her knew about Flight 455, knew she'd broken 17 regulations to save 418 lives, knew she'd been willing to sacrifice her career rather than watch people die. 10 years after Flight 455, Anne was invited to speak at a major aviation safety conference. She stood before airline captains, aviation authorities, and safety experts. "The question you want me to answer," she began, "is whether I was right to break rules. I can't answer that definitively. I can tell you Captain Weber was following proper procedures developed by smart people. I can tell you those proper procedures would have killed 418 people. I can tell you I broke rules that exist for good reasons. And I can tell you 418 people went home to their families because I was willing to break those rules." She paused. Aviation safety is built on procedures, on regulations, on certified limitations that keep us from killing people through reckless flying. Those procedures exist because people died teaching us what not to do. Captain Weber honors those deaths by following the rules. I respect that deeply. But, she continued, procedures are written by humans who can't anticipate every scenario. Regulations are designed for situations engineers could imagine. Sometimes reality exceeds imagination. Sometimes you face circumstances the rule book writers never considered. In those moments, rare moments, hopefully, pilots must decide whether following rules written for different circumstances is actually safer than adapting to reality. I'm not arguing for abandoning regulations. I'm arguing for recognizing their limitations. Captain Weber's philosophy, follow the book absolutely, works until the book is wrong. My philosophy, adapt when necessary, works until adaptation becomes recklessness. Neither is perfect. Maybe we need both kinds of pilots. Maybe the people who follow rules absolutely keep most flights safe, while the people willing to break rules when necessary prevent disasters that rules can't anticipate. She finished simply. I broke 17 regulations. 418 people are alive. I'd make the same choices again and accept the same consequences. Because rules exist to protect people, not the other way around. When following rules means people die, maybe it's time to break the rules and face what comes after. The applause was mixed, some enthusiastic, some polite, some silent disagreement, but in the audience sat families of Flight 455 survivors, including Emma, now a teenager considering her own aviation career, who'd been saved by a pilot willing to break every rule that needed breaking. The question remained unanswered. What matters more, following rules or saving lives when rules prove inadequate? Maybe the question had no single answer. Only 418 individual answers from people who lived, because one pilot valued their lives over her license. Captain Anneliese Richter flew until retirement at 65. Accumulating 31,000 flight hours and carrying tens of thousands safely. She never faced another emergency requiring rule breaking. She followed procedures carefully, respected limitations completely, but the 418 survivors of Flight 455 and their children and grandchildren knew they existed because someone valued their lives over regulations. That was enough judgment for Anne. She'd broken the rules and saved 418 lives. She'd do it again and accept whatever came after. Sometimes being a good pilot means being a bad rule follower when the rules run out of answers. On winter nights when massive A380 South lift into European sky carrying hundreds toward distant destinations, pilots sometimes remember Captain Richter and Flight 455. Remember that procedures are tools, not gods, and that sometimes the most important rule is knowing when to break the rules.